Well, if you'll turn in your Bibles to the book of Revelation. I'm just kidding. I leave that up to Chad to do. Like I said last time, see, I'll let him get all the hate and the irritation from when, he says something in the Revelation you don't like. I won't do that. You can get all that. I'm just kidding. I want to tell you a story about a man who was a farmer in the mountains, maybe similar to a place like Ellijay, beautiful little valley, and he had a nice little farm, and as he was walking through the farm one day, he noticed a little bald eagle that had wandered its way out of its nest. And he grabbed up this little eagle and trying to help it along. It needed some recovery and some little R&R. He took it in, and the only thing this farmer knew how to do was put this little eagle into his pen with the rest of his chickens. And he raised it, and he fed it, and this eagle grew up to be a chicken. And this eagle viewed itself as a chicken. All it ever knew was it was in the chicken pen. It ate like chickens ate. It scratched like chickens scratched. This eagle grew up. It was big, huge, bald eagle in the middle of all these chickens. One day, as man was out there with his chickens, a bird man came by. We'll call him Chris. Where's Chris? We'll call him Chris. Chris comes walking by, and he sees this chicken pen with all these little chickens and this just massive eagle. And Chris walks on by and he says, man, goes to the farmer and says, what in the world is going on here? Why do you have this pen with all these chickens and this eagle in there? He said, well, he tells him the story and he says, well, I rescued him and this is just all I knew how to do. And so this man who knew birds very well, he says, well, I can tell you, it's an eagle and eagles can fly. And the farmer said, well, he said, suit yourself. He said, I've tried over and over to try to get this eagle to fly, but I'm telling you, the eagle thinks it's a chicken. So Chris takes this eagle out and he says, all right, we're going to go out here to the field. And he puts it up and he says, all right, eagle, you are an eagle, fly. And the eagle kind of looks at him and he jumps on down and he waddles back into the pen, goes back to the chickens, scratching, eating. Chris goes back and he says, all right, I know we can get this eagle to fly. It is an eagle. It's not a chicken. So finally he takes it out and they go way out, several hundred yards out away into the field. And he puts it back up and he says, all right, eagle, I'm telling you, you're an eagle. You need to fly. You are not a chicken. You're an eagle. Your beautiful wings. You are incredible. Fly. And so he kind of helps him along and the eagle just sort of glides on down and he looks back at the pen and he sees the pen of chickens and he makes his way back over to where the chickens are. Now, dude's angry and he's like, all right, I've got to figure this out. This is an eagle. It is not a chicken. So he takes this eagle and he goes all the way up to the top of the mountain. And this farmer lived in a valley. He goes up to the top of this mountain. He says, all right, I'm going to get as far away from this chicken pen as I can. And he stands up on top of this mountain and he takes the eagle and he says, you are a beautiful bald eagle. You are the king of the skies. You have everything. You can fly. And he sort of helps him up. And just as he does, this gust of wind comes by and it's just enough to pick up the eagle on his wings. And the eagle flies away. The eagle finally realized, oh, I'm not a chicken. And I just sort of, if I had a bird brain like the eagle, I have to imagine that there are times that I would be flying over and I would look back down on where I used to live and maybe have fond memories, but I would know I am an eagle. I'm no chicken. It's a story of misplaced identity. By the eagle being so close to where it thought it was, it had convinced itself it was really a chicken. And anybody around it could see you are clearly not a chicken. But it was behaving in such a way because it had been around other things like it. It had misplaced its own identity, and it needed to be ripped away as far as possible and given back the life that it had and given back the identity that it had. So this morning, I want to talk a little bit about misplaced identity and what that causes and the issues that cause for us and how that affects the way that we view ourselves in this world and the way we actually view this world. I'm going to do something a little different this morning. I normally like to take a passage and sort of just speak through where that passage is. But last week, I had somebody come up and give me a thought from a passage and give me a big overall picture. He said, man, I've got this great idea for a sermon. And so this morning, I'm going to take this big overall thought from reading the book of 2 Corinthians. And at the end of the day, when we wrap it all up, if the Lord has used any of this to help you, it's all of the Lord. If anything I have to say is something that just doesn't sit quite right, you can go see David Messer after the service and tell him and blame him. But let's look at 2 Corinthians chapter 4. Read a couple of verses here from 16 to 18, and this is Paul now writing to the church in Corinth. So what we're going to do, let me sort of set the stage for you real quick, and then we'll jump into it. We're going to read from 2 Corinthians and read this passage from Paul, explain this a little bit, and then we're going to support this passage with a couple of case studies from some men in the Old Testament. We're going to look at some curious individuals and how they handled life, and support this passage through 2 Corinthians by going back to the Old Testament. But let's look here, starting in verse 16 of chapter 4. And Paul says, "So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day." By the way, Paul makes a really cool little rhyme there, by the way. The inner self is wasting away, but the old is being renewed day by day. Like, pretty cool little thing. And he goes on in verse 17, he says, "For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison. As we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal." You see, Paul does something a little unique in this passage, and instead of just sort of like getting into it, he starts at the beginning and tells us why he's about to tell us what he's going to tell us. He says, hey, what I'm about to tell you, here's the why. Why I'm going to tell you this is because so you don't lose heart. You see, he knew the people he was addressing had spent way too much time focused on the here and the now, the physical world. And because of that, he even tells them, he says, you are seeking after the things of this world. The things that are seen, they're transient. But the things that are unseen are eternal. I want you to think for just a minute of who he's talking to. He's talking to these Corinthian people, and they have poured their lives into the things of this world. And he tells them, he says, hey guys, the things you're pursuing after, those are transient. What does that mean? It means they are ever changing. Because you have spent your entire life pouring after and pursuing after things that are just constantly changing. He's saying, do you not feel disheartened by trying to fill in the gaps of your life, by trying to find that happiness and that peace, and you're trying to do it by everything else, all the world standards. You are running after everything else except me. You're using the transient things of this world, and yet what's happening is they keep moving the goalposts on you. Every time you get to somewhere where you think this will give me the happiness I want, it moves. It's transient. It changes. And imagine, like Paul is writing to these people, imagine feeling that same amount of angst, right? How many times have we done the same thing by we pour out ourselves into something that we think is going to finally give it to us, and it doesn't do it? I'll never forget several years ago, and you can hold the hate till after. Several years ago, so I am a big Ohio State fan, and I'll never forget, I was going through a sort of trying time personally in life several years ago, and I had misplaced an identity in my football team. And I thought the world hung on Ohio State winning or losing every week. And you can ask Diana, it was terrible. It affected our lives. It affected, my mood would swing up and down, and heaven forbid we lose to Michigan, and oh my word, it was just the worst. Well, that particular year, Ohio State went all the way on, and they ended up winning the national championship. And I'll never forget that night. It was joy, it was happiness, it was fun, it was elating, and I loved it. But guess what happened to me? The next morning, I had to wake up and go back to work. Ohio State winning the national championship didn't do anything to affect my life. I remember going to work the next day, and I still had every problem that I had the night before. Every physical or personal struggle I was dealing with, I still had to deal with it. Those problems were still there. Ohio State winning the national championship did nothing to solve my problems. You see, I was chasing a transient thing that I thought was going to fill in the gaps and bring me happiness. That's the amount of turmoil. I remember that next day feeling so much turmoil and lost and confused. That's what Paul is saying. I'm telling you these things so you don't lose heart. And as we see through these case studies of these particular individuals this morning, we're going to see how we need to be reminded. Don't lose heart. Because in the middle of trying to chase the transient dreams of this world, in the middle of trying to look and focus on the things of this world, we have ignored and completely forgotten about the spiritual. What does Paul say about the spiritual? He says the unseen is what's transforming us internally day by day. So let's look at a couple of case studies from the Old Testament and see how our inner desires are first shaped by our identity. Point number one, what causes us to change our gaze from eternal to present, or vice versa? What causes us to change our gaze from the present, the physical, to the eternal? What has to happen inside of us to make us change where we're looking? I want to tell you the story of a famous pair linked in the Bible forever and ever and ever, a man named David and a man named Saul. And we could go on and read dozens and dozens of passages, but I'm going to pick one out this morning. I'm going to read from 1 Samuel chapter 9, and I don't believe I have it up on the screen, but 1 Samuel chapter 9, verses 1 and 2, it says, "Now there was a man of Benjamin," and it goes on to list where Saul comes from, and it's a bunch of hard names, and you can read them for yourself. But let's skip to verse 2. "And he had a son whose name was Saul, a choice young man and a goodly, and there was not among the children of Israel a goodlier person than he. From his shoulders upward he was higher than any of the people." There's a very specific word here that's used two times, goodly and goodlier. And I actually, for this passage, I chose the King James Version translates it this way in particular, and I wanted to use that word on purpose because what he does is that word goodly, what he means by that is it's a physical appearance. What he talks about Saul is Saul had it all going for him. When we look at who Saul was on the outside, we think about a man who, he was charismatic. It tells us physically he was tall. He was head and shoulders above everybody. At this point, the people of Israel had been ruled, if you will, by God in a what we call a theocracy or a country that is ruled by God. They had been ruled by God for hundreds of years, and they've demanded to have a king. Well, Saul steps up. He's ordained to be king. Well, for the people of Israel to be confident in giving their support to a king, I want you to imagine what type of person this would have had to have been. I imagine that this type of person was a little charismatic. He was probably just a little bit full of himself. I imagine him to be like the stereotypical like used car salesman that like is just charismatic enough that like he won't shut up and will keep talking. But also, like, it's just enjoyable enough that, like, you can't walk away. Like, that's kind of who I imagine Saul to be. Like, he's got just enough charisma to, like, want you to keep going. But then, like, after 10 minutes, you're like, dude, will this guy ever shut up? Like, does he talk about anything else but himself? That's kind of, the Bible doesn't tell us that, by the way. I think that's kind of who Saul was. Based off of a character study of Saul, I have the idea that he was that type of person. At the end of the day, though, Saul cared about one thing. Saul cared about who he was and who other people viewed him to be. His earthly, physical appearance and his status and his standing. And we see this take place because there's a story that happens with Saul where he is told to go annihilate a people group. Sounds kind of harsh, but there's a point to it. The story of the Amalekites. Samuel comes, the man that's anointed Saul, the man of God, and he comes and he says, "Hey, Saul, here's what you got to do. You got to go to the Amalekites. They have tortured my people, and you got to destroy them all. Everything. Leave no breath. Don't take anything. Don't do anything extra. Destroy them all." Saul says, "All right, let's go." Gets his army. He goes. He does the work. They go to the battle. And afterwards, Samuel comes to check on him. And this amazing thing happens where Samuel walks up to Saul and he's asking Saul, "Hey, how's the battle?" And Saul's going, "Man, we won. It was awesome. We had this great time." And in the background, Samuel goes, "Oh, wait a minute. Do I not hear sheep baying or baaing or bay or whatever sheep say? Do I not hear the mooing of cattle? Do I not hear the things that I was not supposed to hear? Saul, did I not say that all those things had to be wiped away?" And Saul, remember, his identity being his status, right? Not what God told him, Saul's identity was in what other people thought. Saul said, well, I thought it would be best if we take these things and we're going to offer sacrifices to God. He throws a little spiritual twist on it to try to get himself out. He says, I know I'm disobeying, but listen, I'm really doing this for God. You see, Saul's misplaced identity has now confused what God actually told him with what he thought he knew better. So again, Saul was so concerned about who he was, his status. Why this is important is because in that time, back when kings were around it thousands of years ago, what they would do was a very specific thing when they would conquer a people. They would physically take the brightest and the best of the people from the nation they conquered. Hence, in the book of Daniel, when Daniel is taken captive by the Babylonians, that's why, because the Babylonians are coming in and they're taking the best out. So it was common practice for a nation to conquer another nation and take the best out of it. They would take the finances, they would take all the cattle, they would take all the wealth, and then lastly, they would take the king as a way of mocking the country that they just took. They would take the king and they would parade him around, and sometimes they would cut the head off and they would parade the head. Sometimes they would cut the man's feet off and mock him. But all it was a way for that one king to show dominance over this other group. God knew that Saul needed a little bit of humility, and so God, when he told Saul to go and destroy the Amalekites, he said, it ain't about any of that, Saul. This isn't about your ability to lord yourself over. This isn't about you growing your own self. It's not about you growing your wealth. What I want you to do is I want you to obey me, wipe them off, because they destroyed my people, and there's judgment coming. Obey. But again, Saul had found his identity in who he was. Forever linked in history with Saul, though, is a man named David. You see, Samuel, upon hearing that Saul had kept the king alive, and had kept these sheep, and had kept this wealth, Samuel turns, and as Saul walks away, he grabs Samuel's garment, and he rips it back, and he says, Saul, as I have ripped this garment away, so God will rip away the kingdom from you. And it's a harsh reminder of what happens when our identity is misplaced. What caused Paul to change his gaze from the things above, the things that are unseen, the things that are transforming the heart? What caused Paul to change his gaze to the physical was that he misplaced his identity in who he was. Paul thought it was most important that he had status, he had standing, and that people looked at him well. After Samuel declares that his kingdom will be ripped away, he tells Saul there will be another coming. And ultimately, we know that one ended up being David. And when David was anointed, David was a little, probably middle school-aged boy. And I can imagine Saul, this mighty man that's just conquered this group of people. And by the world standards, he would have looked pretty good. And now, you're telling me a 12-year-old is coming to take my kingdom? Go back to what Paul said. Remember Paul said in 2 Corinthians, what we started? I tell you this so you don't lose heart. Imagine Paul losing heart right now. Paul has lost heart because his focus had been on the wrong things, right? And so just like Paul can say, I'm writing this to you so you don't lose heart, I tell you, stop looking at the things of this world, stop looking at your status here, because if you do that, you're chasing the ever-changing goalpost, you'll lose heart. It becomes disheartening. It becomes terrible to try to go through. And just like Saul is now dealing with the consequences of these things, that's what happens to you and I. So David is told he's going to be the new king. Well, David ends up reigning after Saul. Before that, for a period of many years, Saul actually chases David and tries to murder him multiple times over and over and over. Many of the beautiful psalms that are written from David as he's actually running for his life from Saul, from the one who he knows he's going to take the kingdom from at some point. But there's a very specific thing talked about David. About Saul, it says what? He was goodly. He was good looking. He was outwardly pleasing and appealing. In the book of Acts, though, we're describing David. In the book of Acts chapter 13, David is described like this. It says, "Then he raised up to them to be David their king, to whom also he gave testimony. And he said, I have found David, the son of Jesse, a man after my own heart, which shall fulfill all my law." Saul was concerned about who he was. His status is standing the way other people viewed him. David didn't care about who he was. David cared about whose he was. David had it right. You see, David's gaze was right because David knew his identity was right. What causes David to change his gaze? Because his identity was placed in the right spot. David cared about whose he was, not what other people saw, but that he belonged to God. And we see this no more true than with Saul. When Saul's confronted, what does Saul do? He says, well, I disobeyed, but here's why. I knew better. David goes on and does some pretty despicable things himself. Matter of fact, David has an affair outside of his marriage, and then he murders the woman's wife and then tries to cover it up, and it's terrible. David is also confronted, just like Saul was confronted. But when David's confronted, he drops to his knees and he says, I'm wrong. I'm sorry. I've failed. Because David's identity was not in who he was, but in whose he was. What causes us to change our gaze? Let's check our identity. Are we identified with what the world looks at us? Are we identified with who we are and what people see us and our status and our standing? Or are we most concerned with the one who already stands for us in place of us? You see, David understood something even before Christ came. David knew that God stood in his place as he could not stand. And so instead of us trying to put ourselves out, and instead of us trying to make a name for ourselves, may we just rest in the one whose name we already have. What causes us to change our gaze? Misplacing your identity. I want to look at a couple other stories. Remember, we're all painting this big picture of where is our gaze? What are we looking at? Are we looking at the external things of this world, the transient, the moving, or are we looking at the heavenly? I'm going to tell you a story about a man named Gehazi. Maybe a little less well-known character in the Bible. But the point number 2 is that the consequences of changing your gaze from spiritual to internal, to external, to the physical. Internal toil, struggle, and discouragement. Let me tell you an interesting story, and we read it in our passage this morning. I want to start with just 2 Kings chapter 6, verse 15. I want to read this one verse, and we'll come back to this in a minute. It says, when the servant of the man of God rose early in the morning and went out, behold, an army with horses and chariots was all around the city, and the servant said, alas, my master, what shall we do? Again, what is Paul saying back in 2 Corinthians? I'm writing this to you so that we don't lose heart. I want you to imagine this servant Gehazi, right here in this story we're reading. He walks out, and all he sees is this massive army. I'll give you the context here in just a minute. But just for kicks and giggles, he walks out, he sees this massive army, and he says, oh, what are we going to do? What are we going to do? We are surrounded. There's nowhere to go. Now, obviously, we know the rest of the story, but in this moment, I want you to feel with Gehazi because all he cared about was the physical, and we're going to prove that here in a second by looking at who he was as a person. But all Gehazi cared about is who he was. He cared about the physical, he cared about the here and now, and because of that, oh man, I can only imagine walking out and seeing this massive army, you'd lose heart pretty quick too. Again, why Paul is saying he's telling us this, so that we don't lose heart. So let me tell you a little bit about Gehazi and who he was. Let me tell you the story about Gehazi, and we'll back up this claim that Gehazi cared only about the physical and who he was and what other people thought of him and his own things that he could gain. We'll look back a couple of chapters, 2 Kings chapter 4, and there's some stories that are told about Gehazi, and he's really only seen a couple of times, but the picture of this man is pretty grim. You see, Gehazi is a young man who's a servant to Elisha. He's somebody that God has set up to use as somebody to help out this man of God, and yet we see multiple times here that he's actually kind of doing quite the opposite because his gaze had been misplaced. In chapter 4, verse 27, this is before Gehazi comes out and sees the massive amount of people, right? So we've backed up a little bit. We're going to explain a little bit about who Gehazi was. Why was he in such turmoil by seeing this army? 2 chapters before, in chapter 4, it says, And when she came to the mountain to the man of God, this is talking specifically about a woman that Elijah was ministering to. He had done work with, he had helped her. Now she's coming back to him. When she came to the mountain to the man of God, she caught hold of his feet. She bows down and she grabs Elijah's feet. And Gehazi came to push her away. But the man of God said, Elijah said, leave her alone, for she is in bitter distress. And the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me. What's Gehazi do right here? In the moment where he is supposed to be assisting and caring and helping this woman come to the man of God, she comes down, she bows down before him, and what does he do? He shoves her away. You see, Gehazi being so concerned about the physical, about the appearance, about himself, he deems it necessary that he should be the one to inhibit access to the man of God. And while I think most of us this morning would say, that's not me, I'm not inhibiting access to God. If somebody walks down this aisle and wants to come forward and give their life to Jesus, I highly doubt that any of us are standing here pushing them aside and saying, no, you're good. I highly doubt anybody in this room is there. But do we unintentionally inhibit somebody from coming to Christ? Because our lives do not reflect the life of somebody that should want to come to Christ. Like Gehazi, we might not stand in the way and shove somebody aside, but do we unintentionally keep people from coming to have a relationship with Christ? Because our focus and our gaze and our identity is on ourselves and our own gain and not his and what he has done. And let me tell you right now, like the first person that needs to hear this is this guy right here. How often do I get my gaze off of him? How often do I care about what other people think? How often do I care about my status and my standing? That my first response is not a Christ-like response. My first interaction is not an interaction about what Jesus has done. How often are we turning people away? Or maybe even more than that, how often are we missing opportunities to let somebody come in and see what he's done for us? Because our mind and our focus is not on the spiritual, but is on the physical. If it's me right now, I'm raising both hands, I'm saying it happens all the time. And I think if we're all honest, I think we all say it probably happens way more than it should. And so while we might not be standing like Gehazi shoving somebody away, I would venture to bet that most of us aren't standing there going, please come and hear about my Jesus and what he's done. Because our gaze has been misplaced. We're too concerned with looking not at Jesus, not at what he's done, but we're too concerned with looking at the world, our physical status, our identity as us, as me, what I can do, trying to fill in the gaps with everything else, the ever-changing goalposts of life that are going to make us happy the next time. Put your gaze above. Look to the one who has already done it and invite others to take part of that gaze as well. Do not be like Gehazi who stands in the way of people coming to him. This pretty deplorable story of Gehazi goes further in the next chapter, in chapter 5, and it's a long passage, so we won't read it all. But you can go back and look at it in chapter 5. Another really kind of interesting story. A man named Naaman is a high-ranking official from another country of Syria. And he comes down with leprosy. It's a terrible, deadly disease, physically disgusting, horrible. Had a death sentence, not just physically, but culturally as well. This high-ranking official comes down with this deadly disease, and he hears through the grapevine that there's somebody in Israel that can cure your leprosy. So he gets word to the king of Israel, and long story short, Elisha finds out that this man once cured from leprosy. So Elijah sends word. He says, hey, go tell him that all you have to do is just dip in the Jordan River 7 times. That's it. I wish we could do a whole message on this story because it's a beautiful story, but I'm really rushing through it. Naaman basically gets angry and he goes, who in the world do you think you are to tell me that, like, I'm high and mighty and you're going to tell me to go dip down in this muddy Jordan River? Like, you don't even have the gall to come tell me yourself. You sent a messenger? He feels completely slighted and he says, I ain't doing that. And somebody finally steps up and says, I mean, Naaman, like, what's it going to hurt? Like, you're the one dying of leprosy. The man of God said to do it. So he does. He dips in the water 7 times. He comes back up, and the last time, he's healed. It's miraculous. So Naaman, having had a death sentence in 1 second, and the very next being completely released of this horrible disease, decides he's going to do something for this man of God. So he goes, he finds out where Elisha is, and he goes to his house and says, how can I bless you? He wants to give him all the things he could imagine, wealth, goods, status, standing, all of the things. And Elisha says, no, we don't need any of it. It's not for us. Peace be with you. So glad you've been helped. You have heard the good news of the Lord. You have been changed. You have been transformed. Be on your way. So he does, and Naaman leaves. And then Gehazi. I can imagine him, whether he's in the room or he's in the next room, and he's kind of listening, and he goes, wait a minute. Did he just say no? Did he just say no to wealth and gifts and riches? What in the world is he thinking? It's like, what? How can I? And he begins to scheme and plot. Remember, the same Gehazi that just a few verses ago is shoving people away from the man of God is now plotting and scheming, how can I get this wealth that Elijah, he made the wrong choice. So he waits for a little bit, Naaman goes on his way, and Gehazi feels like he gives it enough time, and he runs after Naaman, and he says, hey, old Naaman, we've changed our mind. We really would like to get all that wealth and the gifts and the privilege and all those things. That's what we really want. So Naaman, obviously willing to give back of what's been done to him, he says, absolutely, here you go, and he gives it to him. Gehazi comes walking back, and there's this great story here in the passage where Samuel or Elijah sees Gehazi walking in, and he's like, hey, man, where you been? And just like a toddler who's, the old adage of catching him in the cookie jar, just like the toddler who's like in the cookie jar with cookies all over his face, and he's like, hey, you been eating cookies? Oh, I haven't eaten cookies. I don't know cookies. Gehazi comes back in, he's like, yeah, Gehazi, where you been? I've not been nowhere. It's like, what you got there with you? Oh, I don't got nothing with me. This is nothing. And he's got this, whether it's bags, whether it's whatever it is, but he's got these gifts that Naaman has given him. And Elijah looks at Gehazi and he pronounces this incredible judgment on him. And he says, because of your care for yourself, because you didn't care about the heavenly, because all you cared about was the here and now. All you cared about was the gaining, was the wealth, was the satisfaction. Guess what's going to happen to you? What's going to happen to you is the very sickness that Naaman was just healed from is now going to affect you and generations to follow you. Whew. Pretty rough consequences of losing your gaze. He lost sight of the truth, and in return, not just was he afflicted physically, but Naaman and his entire family that would have followed him were completely devastated, annihilated, culturally, physically, because he got his gaze off of the things of the Lord and onto himself. So now let's go back to where we started a minute ago, when Gehazi comes walking out and sees this massive army. We've set this up, so now let's go back here. And just like the old Paul Harvey, and now the rest of the story. So Gehazi comes out. Now there's this army that's chasing Elijah and Gehazi. They're angry. And this is the setup. They know that they're in trouble. Gehazi knows that somebody is chasing after him. He walks out, and oh, the fret. Now that I've painted a little bit of this picture of Gehazi, not just is he in fret because he sees this army, but imagine now, you've got this man who has spent time shoving people away from God. You spent this man that went out of his way to be identified with wealth and power and privilege and has now been pronounced on himself judgment, physical pain, and cultural shame. This same man is now walking outside and seeing this army. He paints a little bit different picture of that story. Now I want you to really imagine the heartache and the pain and the vitriol that he would have felt right then when he goes, oh, what are we going to do? Here's a man who probably at this point had lost all faith. His sight was so far away from the things of God and was so close to down here. I'm going to tell you, this was a man who the very last thing on his mind would have been something God was going to do. This is a man that had been so far removed from the things of God. His gaze had gotten so far away from God and so close to himself. The last thing he ever would have thought about was God doing something powerful. But what does God do? We finish the story in 2 Kings chapter 6, verses 16 and 17. Elijah then answers and he says, "Do not be afraid." Remember, just like our main passage from 2 Corinthians, Paul says we write this so you don't lose heart. He says, "Do not be afraid. For those who are with us are more than are with them." Let me pause for a second. Again, remember who he's talking to. He's talking to somebody that has zero spiritual perception whatsoever. And he says, don't be alarmed. Who is with us is way more than what's out there. Remember, he's looking out at like these massive amounts of chariots, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, not thousands or hundreds of thousands. And the man says, hey, don't be afraid. There's more with us than them. Okay. Sure. I don't know what kind of drugs they had back then, but he probably would have thought they were on something. Because there's no way, Elijah, what in the world are you smoking? There is nobody here. He looks around. Elijah so calmly just says, don't be afraid. Because who's with us is more than what's them. Then Elijah prayed in verse 17 and said, "O Lord, please open his eyes that he might see." So the Lord opened the eyes of the young man, and he saw. And behold, the mountain was full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elijah. Oh, what happened when the man who had no gaze for the spiritual finally had his eyes opened and he saw the reality of when your identity is correctly placed in the God who made you to be in relationship with him, who made it so that the only way to find pure peace and happiness and joy is through relationship with him, not chasing the ever-changing goalposts of life. When Gehazi finally realized that was reality, oh, what a sight to see. Now when he looked behind him, and all he saw was not just any army, but he saw God's army. An army that one could only see with spiritual eyes. An army that one could only see when their identity is placed in the right way. An army that is there to wipe out anything that stands in the way that anything physical could ever think it could stop us. The army of God, when our gaze is right, when our mental vision is right, looking at the right place and not down here. Oh, what an army of God can do for us. What's your gaze looking at? Have you misplaced your identity in an identity that focuses on this world and the things of this world? Are you concerned like Saul about who you are status-wise, or like David who's concerned about whose he is? Are you concerned about serving this world that gives you status, or serving the one who's already given the status that you can already have? You cannot have any more status than what Jesus Christ has already given you. Let me explain what I mean. You see, if you know Jesus Christ as your Savior, then you stand in front of God, holy God, just as if Jesus is standing in place of you, because he is standing in place of you. You stand just like you are Jesus Christ. You can have no more status. The status you seek on earth can be no more greater than anything that you ever have standing in front of the God that made you, because you stand as if you were Jesus Christ, the perfect holy Son of God. You cannot change that by chasing the goalposts of life, the transient things. All you will do is find yourself disheartened, in turmoil, in pain, like Gehazi, like Saul. It's the only thing we'll do. Get our gaze to the right place. Let me close with a couple of thoughts. Wrapping up back to 2 Corinthians, remember Paul says, I write this to you so that we don't lose heart. You know why he says that? Because he knows we're human. And there's times when our gaze is going to drop. And there's times when our identity is going to be misplaced. Knowing that, Paul says, let me give you some hope. And he says, I'm writing these things to you so you don't lose hope. What you see, where your gaze is going to determine what you do. Not the other way around. Our actions do not dictate our mentality. Our mentality will dictate our actions. Get the inside right. Figure out your identity. Know who you are. Know whose you are. And then let that drive what you do. What you see determines what you do. Second closing thought. What we focus on reveals our heart. A few weeks ago, Chad said in one of his sermons, and he asked the question, where is the focus of your heart's gaze? Here's what we're asked to do. We're asked to put the focus of our heart, our entire soul, our entire being, on Jesus and Jesus alone. What does that look like? Let me tell you what that looks like. Back several months ago, I had the privilege of walking through the woods with Chad Kelly, doing some turkey hunting. I'll tell you, you want to know what focus is? That man during turkey season is focus. I'm telling you, we walked down the woods, and look, I'm a relatively avid outdoorsman, not a hunter, but I'm a relatively avid outdoorsman. I'm pretty comfortable in the woods and camping and hiking and all that. Like, I'm comfortable being in my surroundings. I'm, all that. And we're walking, and he goes, "You hear that?" Yeah, I hear rustling in the leaves. He goes, "No, there was a gobbler. It's like 200 yards away, up on that ridge, down and over to the left, and probably sitting on the third branch up from the right." And I was like, "What?" So we kept walking a little further, and you hear that again? Oh, there's another. It's probably about 25 yards that way, and it's down on the other side of the holler, in and around, probably sitting on Grandma's front porch. I'm like, man alive, I'm going to tell you what. For those of you that hunt, maybe specifically turkey hunt, the type of focus I'm talking about when we hone in on something that's right in our sights is the type of focus I'm talking about when that turkey comes down to the end of Chad Kelly's barrel. He ain't seeing anything else. You guys that hunt deer, when you see in your crosshairs or at the end of your bow, when you see that thing right at the end, all you can see is what's right there. You ain't looking at anything else. The world could be crashing around you. There could be tree branches falling. There could be people flying around. It doesn't matter what's happening. Your focus is so honed in and so intense on that one thing that you see. That is what we're told to focus our heart's gaze on Jesus Christ. Stop looking down here. Stop looking at the physical. Stop looking at the things that we look to make ourselves better, but look to Jesus and let your heart's gaze focus on Him and Him alone, like a hunter in the woods, honed in on its prey. Let you grab on to Jesus and not look away. So while this is not necessarily a New Year's sermon, the application sort of writes itself, right? When we head into 2025, I just leave you with one question. What are you choosing to see? As we enter into this new year, I ask you, check your identity and check your gaze. Look to Jesus as the only one who can finish, who can step in, who can fill the holes that you're trying to fill. Look to Jesus. In 2025, will you simply look to Jesus?